Welcome to Shared Practices. This is the conversations that occur about practice ownership that you really can't find anywhere else, because you get the perspective of people who've done this in the trenches. We've seen it over and over and over with our coaching clients, with our own practices. And that kind of experience, to have a high-level conversation about what growing practices look like, how to pull all these levers and navigate really what's tricky to do, you just can't find that anywhere else. So, George, I'm so excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, me too. And I think that, one of my favorite parts about Ask George is we essentially take, different things that we've talked about on the Shared Practices podcast, and a term that I like to use is double click on them. And so, this episode today is a double click on a couple of things. So I recently did a practice underwater with Gregorio. So it was my first practice underwater in like maybe 4 years, something like that. And, I had this, it was just a great guy, not his real name, but I call him Gregorio. And the editors, they spelled it the traditional way, but I wanted it to be Oreo like the cookie. But anyway, so.
Greg-Oreo.
Yeah, Greg-Oreo. So, nonetheless, I think that from my perspective, there were some things that we talked about in that episode around the operational components of going from, a solo practice to a group practice, and the financial components of that. And in Gregorio's case, he had an associate. So it was himself, an associate, and then there was a conversation about going from 7 operatories to like 12 and, expanding into that mega group. And I think that there's just a really needed conversation around some of the operational levers that need to be pulled in that expansion process, and also some of the financial components. And one of the things I'm really happy about is that Gregorio is going to be working with our coaching department, and also that allows him to have access to the Ask George Mastermind. And that really brings us to kind of the second call of the Ask George Mastermind, which is the location growth call. And so it's like a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about today are the types of things that will come up on those calls. And I think that you'll see in the conversation how many different moving parts there are to that process of expansion, and how important it is to really get the process down and make sure that your timing for each step is appropriate. So more or less, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is double clicking on the episodes that I did with Gregorio about going and expanding your practice and making sure that you kind of have all your ducks in a row while doing that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the, we talk about this tricky transition from a solo owner into being a multi-doctor office. And this is the nuts and bolts. And this is the stuff that if you get wrong, you have to go backwards. You hear the dentists are like, I tried to hire an associate and it didn't work out. And, they had a miserable experience. And then they give up on the concept of having multiple doctors at one office. Those are great offices to buy, by the way. Like that's the practice you're looking for on the acquisition front. Like, they've got the space, they tried to do it, they scaled up the patients, they put a bunch in marketing, and then it was like, nah, screw this, we're scaling back to one doctor, and then screw this, I'm done with practice ownership. So if anything, we want people to screw this up somewhere so that our pre-owners can have some practices to buy.
That's funny. And so I think that, when I look at this problem, I think there's really like a core thing that we need to start with, which is, in this case, my interview with Gregorio. Gregorio has a 7 operatory practice. He works 4 days. His associate works 3 days, and there's no office manager. And so you think about that, and like, I really look at the office manager as one of the key components of, that transition to having, from having no office manager to having an office manager, being one of the I would call it foundational building blocks to getting this up and running. And, the thing that we talked about in the episode, which is, I think, maybe to help our audience see, like, why is this so important? I remember I was on the interview with Gregorio, and Gregorio was like, oh my gosh, there's so many things we need to do. We need to interview all these people. We need to get their dates lined up. We need to open up the hygiene schedule. We need people to be calling patients. And he just kept going on item by item by item by item. And I was like, yeah, so if you remember earlier, we talked about the office manager. Like, if you have one who knows what they're doing and is fully empowered, then they'll be handling all of these details. And you're just kind of more on the high level, making sure the process is going okay. But like, these details and all the little things that need to happen for this to work, ultimately that needs to be going through your office manager.
So you and I, before the call, I was talking about Alex Hormozy, which is one of my new favorite business mentors to follow. And on the podcast he just did on Diary of a CEO, he talked about so many founders. One of the things they truly screw up is their first hires, like
Yeah.
these first key hires of not knowing what real talent looks like and not being able to invest in, especially he talks about like a million to $2 million revenue business, which is exactly a dental practice. And at some points in that process, you might make a hire that's a big boy hire, office manager, you got to pay more for, but they will unlock for your business what you didn't know was possible. And when you're at our point, like we've seen countless office managers that have been really good and ones that have been mediocre and become the absolute bottleneck for that practice. So like I can't overstate the quality and the necessity of this. And if you don't have a rock star from within to promote, do not compromise on
Yeah.
hiring this office manager going into this position.
So I want to start with the hiring outside approach,
Yeah.
and then I want that to translate to going within. So, I think that, like, Richard, you hit the nail on the head. I think early in my career as an entrepreneur, when I was doing key hires, I think, maybe I knew they were key hires, but I didn't know how to get the type of person that would make the key hire impactful.
Yeah.
And there's this sentiment that I have when I meet somebody who we end up hiring, and it's always this sentiment of like, wow, this person's going to next level this area of oversight, right? So it's like, let's just say you have a couple front desk team members. Maybe you have one or two. You should probably have two if you're going to be hiring an office manager from without. So, you would want to have the experience of talking to that person and thinking, man, if this person was in my office, it would go to the next level. Like, they bring a level of an experience, drive, organization, know-how. Like, they really get it. And that's like when and I think that when I've missed on these types of hires, it's been the type of person who I've thought like, oh, they fit right in, or they seem like the people I have, because ultimately when you're hiring, your perception of that person is always a little bit better than they actually probably end up becoming in the workplace.
Right.
It's just, there's just this excitement and hope and optimism that comes from hiring. And I think oftentimes when you're hiring, you think, okay, well, like this person they fit right in. They seem just like my other team members. Like, that's not who you're looking for in this type of position. A key hire, you want to feel genuinely extremely excited about letting this person loose. Like, that's kind of the sentiment you should have internally in your body, is like, wow, if I just gave them the reins on whatever area of oversight I'm hiring for, like, we're going to go to a new level. And oftentimes it's not that good, but it's pretty close. And
Yeah.
so I think that that's kind of like my just simple barometer for somebody to know. And I think early in my progression as an entrepreneur, I hired people that fit in. And then I started looking for those people who would next level whatever area they walked into. And I found much more success with those key hires when I looked for that next level person who could take it to the next level based on the way that they presented themselves, their resume, their background, all of the things that you look for when you hire.
I mean, you should be looking for an office manager that when you look at them, you're like, this person is a better administrator and manager than I will ever be.
Yeah.
And like, as a cherry on top, like this person maybe is a better business person than me. Like, especially as a dentist, if that's not your strong suit, if you're not a George that just like can see the matrix and loves the metrics, you want someone with strength in this area that maybe isn't your biggest strength. And that is, you look at it like a former regional manager of a DSO who got burned out and just like wants to go back into a single practice, or an office manager who has run like a 4-doctor practice, like a large, insane practice. That is the office manager that can take you to 2 and 3 and 4 doctors, because they've been there and they've seen it done well, they've seen it done poorly, and they're not scared of it. And so I think that's hiring the office manager for the size of practice that you want to go to is what you want to do, and you're going to have to pay more for that person. It's
Yeah.
going to be uncomfortable. It's
And
going to feel scary.
you said something there at the end that I really wanted to touch on, which is this idea that you want to hire somebody whose skill sets are complementary to yours. So, if you are, so for example, I'm kind of a loud leader. I think I'd call myself that. I'm not, I like to talk. And, I definitely bring that gregarious, fun loving, very social attitude to my leadership style. And for me, or for dentists like me, who may be like on the DISC high I type people,
Yeah.
you're going to want, usually that comes with a lack of detail oriented. Usually
Yes.
the other side of that is you're not very detail oriented. And so like, if that's the way you are, then you're going to want to hire somebody who maybe is more of a listener, who's more patient, who's has like compassion and patience for others and is very detail oriented and is like, going to get stuff done and is going to be more execution focused, right? So I think that if you look at, I don't know, me and Suzanne would be a really good example of this type of complement where like her and I have very different complementary strengths, and that's where we work very well together. And so then I think the flip side is the dentist who's more quiet and more, maybe the dentist who's more quiet, you're going to need an office manager who's a little louder. And so I think it's looking at your skill set as a dentist and looking at, like is some introspection on, am I more of a quiet leader who's, maybe keeps more to myself? If so, then I need a little bit more volume from the office manager position. If I'm the loud one who likes to lead and leadership is my, where I get my fulfillment in the role, then maybe I want less of a leader and more of an executor. And so I think that that's where you need to look at like getting somebody who's complementary to your skill sets. Equal and opposite is kind of what I'd be thinking about. So, that's where I kind of go with that. And, I'm just curious, Richard, any thoughts on that?
Well, I actually think of Suzanne. I was talking to someone about when we hired Suzanne for the first time. I mean, I think her new title is VP of Operations.
VP of Client Services.
Client Services. Okay. When we hired Suzanne, that was like all of our profit, and like we were paying her way more than like we were paying ourselves, but we wanted to bring someone in that could run a multi-million-dollar consulting company, which we were not at the time. And that was like terrifying in one way, and it was super exciting in one way, and it absolutely was the right choice. And so, and like you said, very complementary skill sets. So yeah, I think, and we're belaboring this point because nothing will impact your ability to scale better than I think this key hire.
Yeah, a scaling person, right? It's like, all the things required to scale are execution.
Yeah.
And work and hiring and keeping teams accountable. So now let's transition to the internal person, right?
Okay.
And like we've talked about the external person, hiring from without. But most dentists, that's uncomfortable because, they have team members who usually, if you're going to promote within for the office manager position, there's already somebody who you think you're promoting within. Like there usually is not like 2 or 3 people that you pick from. It's either this one person who's very obviously the candidate, or it's you're hiring from without. Like very rarely is it kind of that combination. And one thing that I would look for is I would say, okay, it's hiring from outside. There's a culture cost that comes with that, right? Because if there are people who wanted to have been promoted within, then it's a little bit of a
Bitter pill to swallow.
yeah, it's not going to be their best news. Is like, well, why didn't I get that position? So, I do think that it would be nice for dentists to have a default of promoting within. So I do think that like if the right person is within, then that's probably the play. Now, how do you assess that right person? Well, the same way you would hire, right? You should have that same type of mindset. So all the things that we talked about with hiring, you transfer that to promoting within. Do you have somebody who has a complementary skill set? And I want to maybe just elaborate on, what you're looking for. A good office manager does multiple things. So one, they absolutely have to be detail oriented. I can't imagine the position without somebody who's attention to detail. So like that, there has to be a strong attention to detail and a strong execution. So for example, if this person's job is filling the schedule, then they need to be really good at filling the schedule. If their job is converting treatment, then they need to be really good at converting treatment. Like whatever it is they're currently doing, they should probably be doing that at a high level. And the other thing is you want to look at somebody who's, an office manager is somebody who listens. So when team members have concerns, and it's going to come up all the time, right? I'm unhappy about this person working with them. There's all these conflicts, right? All of those things, the office manager is going to be the source of those. Like they're going to go into their office and they're going to vent. And so you need somebody who's patient, who's going to listen. That's really important. You also need somebody who I would call them a good teacher and trainer. So for example, let's just say we have, a scheduling coordinator, a patient care coordinator who is not performing at a high level, but we think that they're the right person for the role. A good office manager is one that will be able to sit down with that person and help them next level their performance, right? And then the other thing is you need somebody who's going to hold people accountable. So it's like if somebody shows up late, that office manager is the person who is talking to that person who is late. And so all of those things, the office manager is going to be really key for. And if you have that within, and, there's this, when you promote within, there's this like.
There's also a culture cost to promoting within in terms of like, now you're the boss and you used to be one of us.
Yeah, that's what I was about to talk about. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so there is that reality. How is this person going to handle not being the friend and instead being the boss? That's huge. And it's, I think their like involvement in the office drama and how much they've like picked sides and how cliquish this person is, all of those things are indicators of like that being a bigger problem. If they've kind of been embroiled in office drama in the past.
That's a great point, Richard. If this person that you're considering promoting within has had a history of creating drama or being in the middle of drama, that's not the type of person you want to elevate because then now it just would exacerbate whatever problems that they were involved in at the beginning. So I think that that's a great point. And Richard, before we transition out of the office manager, is there anything else related to the office manager that we need to discuss?
Yeah. The one last thing is, I would say, is this person trustworthy to build high leverage systems? So can you give this person the task of, with some guidance, you say, hey, I want you to create kind of your operations manual for yourself, for your position right now. Like, and here's what we want it to look like. And then we could train someone off of this document, and you can update that over time. Can you create a checklist of here's your daily, weekly, monthly responsibilities? And if they can't do that, if they can't build a system that when you solve it once, you've solved this problem for yourself again and again in the future, then once again, that's a person who they need too much guidance on that. They can't take it and run with it. And I think of this one person that we hired as a dental assistant who, at our practice here in Indy, and she had a college degree. She was smart. She worked super hard. And it was like she was being held back by her position. Like I could have seen her in any position. She would just learn and step up to the role, and dive right in and take that on. And she wasn't too worried about being buddy-buddy. She was impatient when other people were poor performers. I think that's a great one to look for is like, when is this person like annoyed that other people aren't stepping up to the plate? In a way that they're just like, come on guys, like be a professional, do your freaking job. Like that's the attitude that you want out of this person. So anyways, this is a great conversation. I don't know if we've had this delineation of hiring from inside or outside before.
So the dental assistant turned front office successfully, turned office manager is a very, very unique person who can potentially do the job very well because they have a complete understanding of the front and the back. And so I would not overlook a dental assistant who's for whatever reason in their history worked both sides of the office. If they've done them both at a high level, that could be a great leader. So, we have this coach who's now working with us, who was a dental assistant, then a front office team member, then an office manager, then a regional manager. And so you think of the progression that, she's gone on in her career. And that's one of those things that like, if you can get somebody on that progression, to be your office manager, they could potentially be the best possible one because of the fact that they have a fluent understanding of front and back. And I think that would not come from somebody who's only ever worked in the front.
They're not
So,
going to take sides. They're not always
yeah.
going to be pointing the finger, at one side or the other.
Well, and there's always this natural tension between the front and the back.
Yeah.
And so, I think that that's where. Now, I want to transition slightly to other topics. So, when we have, when we're going from 1 to 2 dentists, or we're expanding, right? We've talked this whole first time about the office manager, and let's just say now we have the office manager in place, right? There's some things that the office manager is going to have to do. So, for example, the way that you order supplies, right? That's going to have to change because you don't want a dentist to come into your office and have freedom over their own materials. I'm sorry, but if a dentist is applying for the job and they're like, what about what composite I use? What impression material? Oh, you get to use what you want. We're gonna cater to you. Like, all that tells me is that your expenses are going to be higher and your systems are going to be more complicated. It's going to be harder to streamline what you're doing. And it needs to be the other way around. It's, as a practice, this is how we do things. We use this composite, we use this impression material, this is our protocol, this is our burr block, and it's like, this is our clinical setup. And so, we've talked about the office manager, but you need to have leads in other departments. You need to have a hygiene lead and you need to have an assistant lead. And so from an operations perspective, I just want to talk about each of those leads and talk about how do they prepare for expansion.
Can I add one thing to that example that you just added, shared? If you wait to do that until after you hire, it's going to be this committee and this messy process. Oh, yeah. This needs to be done before your first dentist hire. And when they come in and they ask that question, say, yeah, I'm glad to show you exactly what we use and what's standard for us. And that's just what we do here. And so that you can show them, but it's not a conversation. It's not a discussion.
Well, and I think that, Richard, you're bringing up a great point that we haven't talked about, which is there's a 6-month lead time at times where you're bringing on an associate, right? It's from the decision to bring on an associate to that associate's first day is usually 4 to 6 months. And so in that process, you want to be preparing for them to onboard. And to Richard's point, it's much smoother if the first time they ask a question, you have a very buttoned up, systematic, streamlined answer where it's how do we set up operatories or how do we do these things? Oh, these are our processes and systems, and they just fall right within that structure, as opposed to them coming in, doing whatever they want, and now losing that freedom is going to be more of a pain point for them rather than, them coming into a system where there was already a pre-described way of doing things. And so, the dental assistant lead led by the office manager and you, the owner, should have some level of ownership of this is our clinical protocols, and they should be more rigid. And there should be less variability, which is going to bring down your supply costs. It's also going to make it, just more streamlined for you. And ultimately, I find that, most associates do better with that type of guidance than, kind of having their own way of doing things. And so I think that it's just better to just say this is how we do this. And they're like, well, how do I cut a sufficient occlusal reduction on my crown prep? It's oh, we use this burr, right? And it's you just, it's you just kind of make it more systematic for them already. And then when they ask questions, you guide them on how to use the systems that you've created. It's just, in my experience, the best way of doing things. So I think that there's a natural prepare for scalability that is happening across the entire office, right? You need to bring an office manager to be the guide of that scalability. And then you need to go to your dental assistant lead and create systems and processes that are streamlined for each of the clinical components of your practice and that are going to impact the dentist doing production. Then transitioning to the hygiene department, you need to have a hygienist who's training hygiene teams on how to do co-diagnosis in a systematic way, right? So when do we treat this? When do we treat that? So the difference is, rather than an associate walking into a room and being timid and, being well, is this something that we need to do? Is this not something we need to do? Versus the hygienist would already have teed up the treatment necessary based on the practice's philosophy. And then the associate comes in and it's a much simpler conversation for them, and you're going to set them up for success on case acceptance as well. And so that's kind of where, from an operations perspective, those are some of the moving parts that you really need to establish.
I think one more on kind of that clinical back end. We talked about supplies, clinical setups, hygiene, making sure we've got a very standard protocol that just, they almost like can't help but have good case acceptance because the hygienist has already talked about the treatment needed before they walk in the door. I think lab is another one of
Oh
like,
yeah.
here's the lab we use. Here's, the materials that are just our default. Here's what we, I think having just made those decisions, having a reason why, and sticking to your guns on those things is key. So I think that's all the majority of the back end things. The next thing that my mind goes to is like patient flow and deciding where new patients go. I don't know. Is that something that you want to talk about, or go in a different direction?
No, definitely. I think scheduling is a very natural component, right? If you look at the things we've talked about, right? Just to bring it back to like the high level, and then we'll go down. Is when you're bringing on an associate, you're putting stress on the practice because the dentist is such a pivotal position that everything impacts them. The way that we diagnose, the way that we do treatment, the way that we order supplies, and also the way that we schedule. And so, it's really preparing for that additional dentist, or preparing for expansion in the number of dentists, means preparing to systematically do things in a way that is repeatable. And so, that's where, moving on to the front desk, there's really two components of, really getting that dialed in from a scheduling perspective. There's the dentist doing treatment on their schedule, right? So it's like a patient has 3 fillings, they have to do a crown, whatever it is. The front desk needs to know how to schedule that for you, how to schedule that for the associate dentist. And I think if you are thinking that the associate dentist is going to slide into your time slots and your clinical productivity, you probably are going to be disappointed, because I would imagine that they're going to go maybe a little slower than you on certain things. And, you're going to want to set them up with maybe a little bit more time to do their procedures. And so, that's going to be another layer that needs to be added into this process, is how are we scheduling for them versus how do we schedule for the owner doctor? And those likely need to be different. But the other thing is the new patients, that's where and we've talked about this on associate hiring, Ask George. So we're not going to get into it too much, but I think it's imperative that you hire an associate who is comfortable with emergency patients. I just think that is such, if you think about an associate, they're going to start slow. They're not going to have as much on their schedule. So that patient who calls in day of in pain is going to be happy to see them. And having an associate who can handle those types of patients is great. So I think, the emergency patients, you're going to want to slide those onto the associate schedule. And the new patients, you're going to want them to be in hygiene. And, you can either have a system of first ready available is going to do the exams. You could have a system where you pick certain hygienists and they'll go with a specific dentist, 2 for the owner doc, 1 for the associate. But you just need to have some type of delineated way of splitting exams. And, I'm a big proponent of bringing new patients in through hygiene, so I'm not going to necessarily deviate from that. But then you're also going to want to bring in new patients on the associate schedule in the doctor's side to keep them busy and keep them productive with stuff that could be same-day dentistry.
I think there's also deciding what procedures that if you diagnose, are you going to try and put on the associate schedule, and deciding up front, here's the stuff I want to do less of. And but that would allow them to have more production, keep them fed, versus I hate it when I talk with someone who's like, yeah, we're kind of treating it like I've got to build up my patient base within the practice. It's like a startup for the associate where they're slowly, and they're just twiddling their thumbs. They're not making a lot of money. And the owner doc's just being greedy. They're just saying, I'm going to take the production, you're going to take the crap, and not feeding them a lot of new patients or existing patients whenever appropriate. And it's hard because patients always want the owner doc. They always want the original doctor. And so there has to be just kind of a firm, this is what we're going to do. Hey, I think limiting the owner doc's clinical days so that the owner doc is booked out further, or just kind of giving patients, if there's procedures that aren't going to go to the owner doc, giving them, hey, we give them an option 3 weeks out or 4 weeks out, or they can be seen next week or this week with the associate.
I think the value proposition for an owner bringing on an associate, you're going to increase your stress level. There's going to be more financial stress. There's going to be all of these other things. Well, there needs to be some benefits too, right? And the benefits are your practice is going to be bigger. You're going to have, more of a business underneath you. You're going to grow your net worth. But also on the daily, you should be working a little less. So, if you're working 4 days, you should go down to 3 days, and you should be equally as productive. So that's kind of like where I would think should be the value proposition from an owner's perspective. And I think a very simple one is your fillings, right? Like if you go in and a patient has some class 2 fillings, for example, like you should have your front desk know that whoever diagnoses, so the way that I always do it is if the associate diagnoses treatment and discusses that with the patient, then it goes on the associate's schedule, right? It should never go from the associate getting case acceptance to the owner's schedule. That's brutal, right?
Yeah.
From an associate's perspective, they're not going to like that.
Psychologically.
Yeah, that's just tough, right? Because they're already struggling to stay busy. And so you have that has to be known, right? Your front office teams have to know that if the associate did the exam, the associate is the one that does the dentistry. Now,
even if there's like one procedure the associate doesn't do, like have the associate do all the rest of the dentistry and then push that one procedure over to the owner doc.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And, and then the other thing is, but then the other way around, you should be feeding their schedule just a little bit, right? Yeah. So, what I did when I brought on an associate was my front office knew that if we had fillings that I diagnosed, the default was to always offer the associate schedule first. So let me just kind of walk through a handoff, right? I did a hygiene exam. There was a couple of class 2s that, patient had some interproximal caries, like we need to get these done. So we talked to the patient, show them the x-ray, they go up front. And, the front desk says, oh, okay, we see that we have, maybe 12 and 13 that we have to do some fillings on. Would you like to see Dr. Associate at this time? Right? You just offer the associate first. You don't ask the patient, would you like to see the associate? No. You just say, the first available that I have to do this is with the associate at these times. And let the patient, most patients are going to be like, okay, and they're not going to think about it too much, and they're going to end up on the associate schedule. The associate's going to be busy, and then you will have more breathing room on your schedule to fill it with your productive cases, right? And that's ultimately how you get to that place of working less, producing the same, is you're trading your less productive procedures for you may be constraining your schedule, and then you're only doing productive procedures. And what that's going to end up being is you're going to get real close to what you were producing 4 days a week and 3 days a week. And so your income, should hopefully not take a hit, and you should be working less, right? That's a good situation for the owner. And then for the associates like to be busy. That's something I learned very early, is like associates like the feeling of a lot of things on their schedule. They're not so discerning on the value of, it's like if they have a patient where they're doing fillings, then they're happy that they're doing dentistry and they're happy that they're busy. And like, that's kind of what's the way that they look at things for the most part. And so, that's where, you can set them up for success and also, make your schedule more productive. And that would be kind of how I'd be thinking about it.
And to be clear, if they're doing a bunch of restorative versus just any restorative, like that's like just get something on the schedule that is some level of productive, they will start to complain if you're throwing all like the $0 appointments on their schedule and like screwing them over on that front. So it's something you can do, but like don't lean too hard into like it's all denture adjustments and deliveries that aren't getting them money type thing. So
but keep your night guards. Like night guards, Invisalign, like that stuff, you want to keep the stuff that is productive without a lot of your time. Like those things you don't want to give. You want to give the stuff that is not productive and requires a lot of your time.
Setting those expectations, setting up the schedule. What are other things in terms of, is there anything with like insurance or billing that you would want to address, or what other topics do you want to hit on?
I think that at this point, I think we've covered the operational stuff, and maybe we transition to the financial topics, because I think that, in this, double click on the expansion, right? There's really two sources of stress. The first source of stress is operations. And we've talked about that for the first 30 some minutes of this episode, where we've talked about, preparing your practice for scalability and expansion through streamlining and standardization, right? That's kind of the theme of what we've been discussing so far. But then, to bring you back to the example of Gregorio from the Practice Underwater, Oreo spelled like the cookie, he had a 7-operatory practice. And there's a space next door that's available for lease that potentially is able to do, 5, 6 operatories. And there's a stress that comes with that. It's like, whoa, my rent is going to be how much now? My, people costs, I'm going to have this much in debt. And, what I told him in that episode, which I want to talk about now, is how do you prepare for the financial stress of expanding your practice? Because you're expanding your overhead. And, like currently, let's just say you're a solo dentist, your overhead is usually less than you produce clinically per month, right? So like you can produce more than all of your expenses and have an income before you even account for hygiene, usually. And once you bring on an associate, your costs go up to the point where that's no longer the case. Your production oftentimes is less than the total monthly expenses of a practice with an associate, which means in order for you to be profitable, the associate has to produce a healthy amount, hygiene has to be productive, and your expenses have to be in line. So there's really like two sources of stress, in this financial regard. It's like, monthly break-even point expanding, and also often comes with additional debt, that comes with it, right? So, what Gregorio was asking, like, do I pay cash for the construction and do I like do that? I'm like, no, 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 no.
Mm-mm.
You want to, the worst type of stress you could ever have is cash flow stress. So it's like the last thing you want is to be needing money to live or to invest in your business and not have that readily available in your bank account to get quickly. So the way that you kind of prepare for this is hunker down financially a little bit, and you want to hoard cash. You really want to hoard cash in this mindset until
Yeah.
the practice is, so like in this 13, like going from 7 operatories to 13 operatories, until we are like every single month, I don't have doubt that we are going to be profitable. I'm going to be making enough money to cover my living expenses, pay for taxes, and save a little bit of money. I'm hunkering down. Like until I get to that profitable, simple, sustainable place again, where like things are just working and the money just adds up and it all is an equation that works in my favor. Until I get to that place and I'm in that middle ground, I'm in survival mode. And survival mode means hoard cash, take on debt, and be diligent with your expenses, right? And so I think that that's the next conversation that I want to have is, there's a lot of merit behind expanding. We've talked about that. If somebody's listening to the Shared Practices podcast, they have to know that we understand and believe in growth. But there's also the financial reality of growing, where profitability and practice growth are two forces that often work against each other at times. And so when you're growing quickly, it's often in exchange for profitability. And, you have to be prepared to weather that storm. And so that's, I think, the next portion of the conversation is really that financial stress that comes with growth.
Well, and I think there's a spectrum here of like, here's the ideal scenario. The really ideal scenario is that like within the office you can expand and it's just the cost of equipment and the delay is not that long. Those are the expansions that like are so easy to like green light and say like, why would you not equip these operatories or even do some construction to move stuff around? And then it's like the lease next door that you could expand into, get some TI dollars. Your main office is still fully operational. You're not, you're taking out the equipment loan. You might have some build out costs. But maybe you can get those kind of like financed in a creative way, like a startup. You can get 0% interest for 6 month stuff on equipment loans. Like you can bake in some space between you and those loans. The hardest ones are I did a startup, I did a recent acquisition, I still have a fat loan, I've grown into my space, especially if like you haven't grown into a 2-doctor space, you've grown into like a 5-op space, and now you're making the leap into like an 8 to 10-op practice, but it requires you to relocate completely and either do a gray space or, heaven forbid, ground up. So like, I think there's a very huge spectrum of what is possible. And this discussion goes from being on one end of it, such an easy discussion to have. And on the other end of it, like, no, this is a real leap of faith. And you need to have all the market factors in terms of, I know I can get the new patient flow. I know we've got the profitability. I know I can attract doctors and retain doctors in this area. and that the population will support this. Like, it becomes it requires you to have a much more informed position of your guarantee of success, the bigger the risk of expansion, the delay of expansion, the cost of expansion.
You said a couple things there that were great. I think the first one is, you're betting on the future, right? You're betting that in the future, you're going to have enough patients to support more doctors. You're going to have enough cash flow to support more expenses. And so you probably should be very confident in the future. And in the case of Gregorio, Gregorio is in a market that's like outside of a secondary market. So it's like tertiary, secondary type place, tons of demand, hygiene booked out for months. And it's just close enough to a major city where you can get doctors pretty predictably. So he kind of hits a lot of those boxes. And it's really just build it and they will come because the demand is there. And so, in his case, on the practice underwater that I did, I didn't spend much time on that because it was very apparent in the conversation, like we can't get people in hygiene. Like it was just very apparent that there was just bustling demand. But then you think of yourself in like, I'll call it Dallas. It's just Dallas, Los Angeles, those two cities, right? Like that's a real thing. Like if you go to 13 operatories, there's no guarantee that you're going to have the demand necessary to pay for the expenses. You can get dentists in either of those cities, but can you get patients in a sufficient quantity to make that work? Like that's a real thing. And so I think that, you're bringing up a great point and, you have to do that type of diligence, right? And I think the other great point that you're making is once you do that type of diligence, you need to buy yourself time. Time is the more time that passes, if you've set it up properly, the more momentum you'll have, right? Yeah. If you didn't do that checklist properly to make sure that this is the right thing, then time isn't necessarily going to help you very much because with time, you're still going to be struggling to get patients or you're not going to be able to get doctors. And then, time isn't your friend. But like no payments on things for 6 months, TI dollars in your lease, like you really got to find a way to hoard cash, take on as much, TI dollars, equipment loan from the bank for construction, like all of these different sources that are cash now or like get you expanded now with obligations financially as late as possible would be ideal so that you can get yourself time to get that up and running before the kind of the financial stress will start to come with the more bills that you'll have. And so, I think kind of, managing the finances of this is really heavily focused on managing the cash flow. And you need to make sure that you're preserving your cash, that you're being diligent about your expenses at the practice, which if you remember earlier in the episode, we were talking about streamlining your supplies. Well, now this is where that helps, right? That's an extra $5,000 per month potentially that you'd be saving in supply costs by being streamlined that would then go towards your expanded rent, for example. So it's like you gotta be, diligent in those three areas: preserving cash, minimizing your outlay on expenses, and managing your expenses to be ramping as slowly and delayed as possible, right? And those are kind of your three levers. And if you have, a lot of times dentists in these situations have a good savings, like they have, a good amount of savings that's just sitting there liquid. Like that's good. You need that, right? You need that to sleep at night and to know that, okay, like I got my personal expenses covered for this amount of time. And, that type of thing is going to be really crucial.
Well, and I think that's where the bigger the leap is, the more like the personal buffer starts to play. How much cash is in the bank, what your nut to crack personally is, how much you've expanded into the lifestyle, a spouse who works, like all of those things start to play into how big of a leap am I willing to make. And from it's been really cool over the last couple of years to talk with our coaching clients who have been through the journey of adding a doctor at their first location, or their office, and like that initial leap of faith of like, we're taking on hygiene, we're bringing on a doctor. But when they've done it once and they've gotten to the other side of it, all of a sudden, like that decision to expand again, they kind of know we've got the demand. This is how long it took to fill this out. This is what it did for our practice. There's this sense of like, how could I not? If I like this, how could I not? And versus the doc who bought the one doctor practice that can't expand to a second doctor. There's two leaps of faith going on at the same time. It's the first time they're adding capacity to their office and they've got all these extra costs and it's scary. And it's the first time they're pulling these levers of hygiene, operations, extra doctor. And so that's where it goes back to how big of a leap is it? Can you build that buffer personally? Do you have those circumstances personally that allow you to take a bigger risk? And can you be patient to find the right opportunity? Maybe there's a merger that's into a bigger practice that you can like kind of take over and absorb, and then you've got opportunity to expand. Can you find different weird opportunities where a dentist retired and they couldn't sell the practice and it was a big practice and that kind of stuff? You start to put your ear to the ground and be patient and prepare for that. And then when the moment's right, pull the trigger and go for it.
Yeah, totally. Very well said. And I think that, that kind of brings us towards the end of this episode, right? Where, I think that that's a great way to kind of wrap it up, which is all of this is at the end of the day a leap of faith, which is why, we kind of talked about, the things necessary to succeed in that leap of faith. And I think that, to kind of wrap up the financial part, we talked about that 6-month timeline in operations, right? And there's a similar 6-month timeline that you prepare yourself financially for as well, mentally preparing yourself for it, expanding your patient base. Like ideally, if you're expanding your facility, before you expand, you want to be busting at the seams in your current facility, right? You don't want to be like barely filling up your current facility and then going to a bigger facility, right? So there's all of these things that you need to do on the front end. And, the more that you front load that process and you put the work in advance, the smoother that process goes and that leap of faith gets rewarded. And then you begin that cycle of wanting the next leap of faith and, kind of just going from, like we have like our clients who started with us as a solo practice and now they have 3 or 4 associates, right? And it's like, they added the first one that went really well. They saw what it was like. They got a taste, then they go and they keep going. And so, I think that, to kind of sum up this episode, it's really, preparing for what's needed to succeed at the next level, whether that's an office manager, a hygiene lead, a dental assistant, systems for scalability and standardization, or, managing your cash flow, minimizing your cash outlay, and reducing your expenses while keeping your savings. Like those are all of the things that we've talked about that make that leap of faith safer, so that when you do it, you can ultimately end up on the other side, pleased that you did so, as opposed to regretting, which will be the next Ask George that we talk about.
Yeah. So, and I'll tease here for the next episode a scenario that I'm going to bring up to you on the start of the next episode, which is a dentist who is considering going from like 9 ops, 2 doctors to a 20 op ground up build. Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about like this, when people have made decisions they regret, when partnerships aren't working. So tune into this next episode. It should be a good one. And I would love to talk about that now, but I'm like, we don't have time in this one. Let's push that to the beginning of next one. And then we'll go into the rest of that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of Ask George. As Richard said, on the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at the other side. When you make risks and they don't work out, what do you do?